Hello, my name is Mike Shea, and I'm the host of the DM's Deep Dive here on the Don't Split the Podcast Network. Today, we're going to talk about our experiences with 3 years of Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. And our guest for this talk is none other than Mike Mearls. Mike, would you please introduce yourself?
Hey, everyone. Mike Mearls. I am the Senior Manager for Design and Development for the Dungeons & Dragons team. So I'm the Senior Manager of D&D for D&D. I've been working on D&D for about 12 years now, and I was the co-lead designer on 5th edition.
Very good. First of all, I'd just like to start off. I'll just throw my sappiness right in. I love 5th edition. Woo! And the fact that I have two different groups that I run on a weekly basis, and it never, it always amazes me to think about what D&D is bringing to people, the joy that D&D is bringing to people all over the world. Getting people to sit around a table and play games is amazing. So thank you for that. It's a wonderful.
Sure, thanks for playing.
So I like to start off the show by kind of digging right into. So the purpose of our show is not to hit like surface level stuff. It's to, particularly from a DM's perspective, dive deep into a particular topic. And now that D&D 5th edition has been out for 3 years, I feel like I'm starting to get a handle on it maybe. And I expect that you guys feel like you're getting a handle on how people are using it. So I thought it would be interesting to kind of dive into that topic. I always like to start off by asking like what 3 major tips our guests have, and in your case, I have a slight modification to it. So I want to say like, what top 3 tips do you have for 5th edition Dungeon Masters today that we might not have already heard?
See now, okay, I get hard mode, don't I?
Right.
Work in the game with more is expected of you. So I think the one thing I would say, and this is based on seeing, I get a lot of questions on on Twitter about the game, and people have, well, how does this work and how does that work, and this is the mechanical questions, but I also get a fair number of DMing questions. Mm-hmm. So I'm going to cheat because I'm going to give you one big tip, and I'm going to break it down into multiple pieces.
That'll work.
So I think the thing that people have to kind of learn, especially if they played 3rd and 4th, is 3rd and 4th really, I think, condition Dungeon Masters to think tactically, to think, here is the villain, and you fight the villain, and the fight against the villain is the end point of the campaign, rather than thinking more organically and more strategically. And this is something I've kind of, myself, that I've learned. You talk about 3 years into the game, this is kind of what I've learned. That when you think of stories and you think about what happens often in novels and stuff like that, it's not necessarily the fight scene that's the final thing that determines everything. It's the character arcs. How does a character change over time, and what they experience, and how that changes them as people. So I think that's the first thing I would say, is think strategically and think a little bit more about how are the characters going to change as people from point A to point B, beyond just getting levels, right? What does it mean to go from first level in your campaign to level 10 or 20, whatever your stopping point is? And when that answer is really what your campaign's about. And then when you think about what your campaign's about, think it in real world terms. Think if violence is off the table, right? You can't fight. You want that promotion at work, but you can't just beat people up at work and get it. What would that look like? And then think, how can I then work that into my campaign? Because what I found is that fights are really fun, right? It's the heroic part of the game. And I think a lot of this advice is coming from a standpoint of fights are appealing, so it's very easy to go that direction because people find them satisfying. It's a lot of just drama and baked into them.
Right.
Will my character die?
Right.
Will we win? Will we lose? The dice rolls, all that stuff. But what I've found is that the fights are even more interesting when you have in the background that constant, what does this mean in the bigger picture? There are things I want that I can't just mechanics my way into, like casting the right spell or using the right tactic. If, for instance, I want to redeem the name of my father or my family, right? Then my character's arc is actually I'm going to go from level 1 to 10, but really the purpose of my character's arc is I'm from a fallen noble family that was accused of treachery, and we were the ones that let the dragon take over. And so I can kill the dragon, but that doesn't necessarily make people might still think I'm a jerk, right? So how do I redeem my family? And things like that. So that's the second thing I talk about is when you're thinking strategically, then think about what that means for your characters in terms of what's important to them. So think strategically, then think what's important, and then finally, as a dungeon master, go after that stuff, right? Make that stuff hard to get and threaten it. There's the one last informant from the old Legion who knows? No, it wasn't your father who betrayed and opened the gates. It was this other guy. Or oh, but what happened? Where is he? What happened to him? Right? Like, does the bad guy kidnap him or try to kill him? Right?
Mm-hmm.
Or is he dead? And what you need to do is find his corpse and cast Speak with Dead on it.
Mm-hmm.
And there's no cleric in the party, so now we have to find someone to cast Speak with Dead and is willing to do it for us.
Mm-hmm.
And those questions I found, what happens is, and this kind of goes back to the design of Fifth, and a weird thing we found that we didn't expect. We found that when we asked people if they liked a character class, they would tell us, I like it or I don't like it. And that's obviously useful. But what we also asked was, how complex do you think this character class is in combat and out of combat? And what we found was really interesting was that the classes that were simplest in combat, but most complex out of combat, were the most popular classes. Mm-hmm. And I always thought there was something really interesting there.
What's an example of a class like that?
So a good example would be if you think of how a lot of, and so this is also part of it, put on the filter of a lot of people watching this are more advanced players. Mm-hmm. But if you think of how a lot of people, especially beginning players or not mechanically minded players, might play a wizard, where, combat spells, fireball, magic missile, burning hands, simple, right? Just cast it, do damage. Non-combat spells, Speak with Dead for clerics is an example, right? Where it's like, casting something like Speak with Dead has a lot of actual complexity into it, if you think not mechanically, but in terms of the story.
Sure, yeah.
Who are we going to talk to and what are we going to ask them? Because we only get 3 questions.
Right.
And that, I think, it opens up this big spider web of options for players that then actually gets really intriguing. And the way I think of it is, I don't think D&D players mind complexity if it's complexity that involves the entire table.
Right.
Like, the classic thing, okay, we're going to cast Speak with Dead on this guy.
Yeah, everybody has to, right. I love those scenes.
Weighing in. Yeah. And you don't feel, it doesn't feel artificial. It feels like, this is a discussion our characters would have.
Sure.
Rogan the fighter would say, of course we have to ask him about this. And then the thief's going to say, we should ask him where the treasure is, right? Things like that. Mm-hmm. And it really helps, I think, reinforce that. Mm-hmm. So those are my 3 things, but it's kind of one, which is basically play the long game.
Mm-hmm. No, that's a good one. And you started that by talking about boss fights, and that was something I wanted to get into a little bit later, but I'm going to jump in now. So you had a discussion, a roundtable discussion recently with Adam Cobell, who wrote Dungeon World, and with Matt Mercer and Matt Colville. And Adam actually brought that up. He said that one of the interesting things about D&D, not specific to Fifth, but D&D overall, is that you think about like the pacing of a movie, and you look at something like John Wick, right? And there's this like progress of fights that go on, him versus the minions, and him versus some tougher minions, and introduce the evil sidekick, and then later he kills the evil sidekick, until finally he's like in that showdown with the old guy, and somehow the old guy gets a bunch of hits in. I don't know how that works, but but there's this progress, right? And there's this sort of tension of, John Wick's shot and he's hurt, but he comes back and does all right. Yeah, you see with all sorts of things. And Adam brought up that D&D isn't really built that way, and that you could have a boss fight, and it's like, this aboleth comes out and its psionic ability is crazy, and they're like, force cage, done, right? And as a DM, you're like, what that, now what do I do for pacing, right? They just wrap the boss in a force cage and I'm hosed. And, it's like I went from John Wick to No Country for Old Men, where the main character's killed off screen. Yeah. So, I that probably boss fights and how to deal with them. And I'm totally on board with you about not thinking about it from like a 3-stage encounter, and stage 1 he'll do this, and stage 2 he'll do this. In my Curse of Strahd game, Strahd became a quest NPC, right? He knew the party's going to kill him, so he's like, well, let me send them off against other things, And I'm dealing with the end of Storm King's Thunder right now, and the main villain's like, okay, I'm pretty sure they're going to come here and kill me. What do I do about that? Right?
No, that's it.
So I'm on board with that, but I still feel like we want, you want these sort of set piece climactic battles, and for me, they're the hardest thing to do well. I mean, I don't know. There's probably other things that are harder I'm not thinking about.
No, but I think it is.
Yeah. So what do you like? Do you run set piece battles, and have you seen set piece like large, high level, big boss fights at the end of campaigns? And how, what seem to be the easy tricks for building those and still keeping that pace at the right level?
So I think the trick for me, I'll just give you here's just my perspective on it and what I've run and what's worked for me. What I typically do in my campaign prep is one of the things I've learned is I don't try to think ahead too far when it comes to things like tactics and stuff. Because one thing is, at the end of the day, it's 6 people versus 1. and 6 minds working together, and then bringing together the full abilities of their characters.
They're going to win. Yeah,
they're going to win, right? And so I instead give myself a bit of liberty to think more in terms of the feel I'm going for. And this is, a lot of DMs will look at this and not want to do this. This is why I'm just saying this is work for me.
Sure.
And a lot of ways say, as a designer, this is kind of like the system should just do all this.
They could just tweet you about it. That's fine.
Yeah, exactly. But at the end of the day, really what you're doing is you're saying, here's how I want this fight to feel. And here's what I want the dramatic effect to be. And I think that's something that's important to focus on rather than start with mechanics, is think, what's the dramatic effect? How do you want the players to feel as they're dealing with this? Think of it as a story, right? If you're a fan of pro wrestling, which I am, a good wrestling match has a story embedded with it.
Right.
You take the heel versus the face, the good guy versus the bad guy, and look, the good guy is stronger, faster, blah blah blah, better than but the bad guy pulls out a folding chair, or he tweaks the good guy's injury. The good guy we know he hurt his ankle last week, and now the bad guy's working on the ankle. It builds a story, right? And now you start going, now the good guy's hopping around on one foot. He can't do his super kick. That's his finisher, right? You can't do it. How's he going to win, right? Or he's going to grit through the pain and do it. So I would totally steal, and I steal from pro wrestling and this idea of what's the gimmick for this fight, not mechanically, but dramatically. What do I want the players to feel? Is it they are fighting the villain, and what's really stressful here is that they know they have to defeat this guy like in 30 seconds. They can't get into the chamber, the chamber in the middle of the volcano until the wards drop, and the wards aren't going to drop until 30 seconds before the volcano blows. But if they get in there and defeat him quickly enough, like the energy he's gathered is going to dissipate, and boom, there we go, right? And so things like so then you think, okay, it's about time pressure. It's about, so what I want to throw into this fight are things that slow people down. I want to frustrate the players. I want to make them feel like, we can't get there, right? I want to use distance as a thing. And then you have the fun thing of when you have an understanding as a dungeon master of how you're going to frustrate the players now have something to overcome, and they get to feel cool when they do it. When the elf wizard is like, no, I'm going to teleport next to the guy. Oh, okay, or whatever, dimension door. You're putting things in front of them that they can feel excited about overcoming. And I think that as long as the players feel a sense of like triumph and accomplishment in the fight, even if necessarily the hit point numbers don't match up, like they know the stakes before the fight starts. So I think it helps a little bit with that feeling of the fight falling flat, because the players know what the stakes are before the fight starts, and they kind of have a sense of what they need to do. They're not going in blind. And then as a dungeon master, again, you kind of think, what's that line you're building? And as I put my hand up in the camera,
right,
you have a sense that of how you're going to frustrate, but then give players those moments of triumph. And I think that's another thing to think of too, is what other than killing the monster or the bad guy is going to make people feel accomplished during the fight? Right. Is it that there is, another example might be, here's the big bad guy, in a straight up fight, you can kill him, but he's in the middle of this giant fortress surrounded by guards. And so the boss fight isn't necessarily the confrontation with him immediately, it's we have to infiltrate this place, because even though 18th level, there's 5,000 orc warriors here in an army. And, just even at 20th level, 5,000 orcs will... It's
a lot of javelins.
Yeah, exactly. And so you get the sense of, the real risk here is if the army finds out we're here, if we're discovered, if we're exposed, how can we get in? And then during the fight, right? Okay, we might kill this guy, but then, that's when you start getting interesting things of, we used our high level spells to take him out. Now we can't. Do we save that teleport? Right. The ending of Critical Role, right? Where right. Spoilers, right? But that sense of this character is going to cast this 9th level spell, but it actually the important thing wasn't that they necessarily
completely altered how the whole campaign played out.
Exactly. That's why I loved what Matt Mercer did with that thing. It so plays into what I've been thinking about a lot lately. Is you're thinking, you're planning through that fight. You do the fight's not the end point. It's what's going on after it, and it's the after the fight is actually where you want the payoff and the excitement to rest.
Right. That's great. So taking a step back and kind of tapping into what you've seen and how you've seen the game getting played. What has surprised you about how the game is played versus what you released 3 years ago?
I think we were still, I have to admit, like I talked about the 3rd and 4th edition mindset and changing that. And I think it's also a process that we've had to go through. Because I think for myself, that's how I thought of it, because I'd been running the game that way for so long. And I think seeing the audience really respond to that was also something which I didn't really expect. the way in which we are, like ourselves, if you look at our adventures, since we launched the game, I think you're seeing a trend. It's not super pronounced, but I think it's going to get more accelerated. We're moving more and more away from that set piece fight and more to that. Here's a situation. How are you going to deal with it?
Right.
Asking questions but not having an answer. Like there's no right answer to this, but just you figure out how you want to deal with it. And what you basically giving the players an opportunity to decide what's the right answer here. We come to, and I always get the names messed up because there's I think it's Camp Vengeance is the one that the Order of the Gauntlet founded after screwing up. How do you resolve that? Is there a right answer to resolving that? And the Adventures, it has no right answer. There's no you must do X and Y to win. No, it's just this is a really crappy situation.
Right.
A person who is good, their alignment's good, cosmically they're good, but they're kind of incompetent.
Right.
And they're a jerk. How do you resolve this, right? And the party that could range from the characters walking away with the place in flames. It could be with them redeeming the guy and getting the turnaround and making it actually work. It could be them convincing people just abandon this. This is crazy. You guys need to get out of the jungle. You shouldn't be here. But the adventure doesn't give you a right answer. It just gives you a situation and lets you run with it. And I think you're going to see us doing more and more of that because that's one thing that has surprised me is how when we look at the growth of the game, I think that's what's actually pulling people in is that feeling of I have a lot of agency and the game is challenging me in ways that other games can't, specifically like playing a video game. Right? Where video games do have, here's the right answer.
Sure.
Or they're Minecraft, right? We're okay, there's no right answer, but there's no story.
Right.
You can create a narrative, but the game doesn't, that's just purely you.
I hate creepers. That's the story. So a question. So was that sort of narrative? I'm not sure I'm encapsulating everything you said into one word, but I'm going to try. So the narrative focus, the idea that situations exist, they don't have a right answer, and people are dropped into these situations, and the fun is figuring out how to navigate them, and it's unique to every group that runs it, right?
Yeah.
Was the 5e drive towards that style intended when the game came out, or is that something you've seen people now taking it towards, and you're sort of doubling down on it as you saw people move that way? Yeah, no, it's definitely something where people have taken the game that direction. Okay. If you look at our first couple adventures, they have some of that here and there, but it's definitely something we're becoming more aware of and more designing. They were procedural, right? Yeah. Go to this place and that place and that place and that place. Fight the guy here. Gotcha. And I think with Prince of the Apocalypse, you saw us go, let's do something that's more sandboxy. Sure. Yeah. But it wasn't necessarily fully there yet. I think if Princes is a fine adventure, don't get me wrong. But Princes as a sandbox versus Tomb as a sandbox, I think shows you a lot of how our thinking changed. Yeah, and you sort of swing in the gauges, really heavy. You look at Storm King's Thunder, and I'm not sure sandbox is the right term for it. Right, it's like a sandbox with the box part broken out. Yeah. Compared to other ones where Curse of Strahd, where there's a non-literal sandbox, but you can't get more refined than there's a fog and you ain't walking through it. Yeah. So yeah, I can definitely see that, and then looking at Chult, right, a big peninsula, there's again sort of a nice boundary around it. That's interesting. So are there parts that you put into 5th edition during the design? And now 3 years later, you people, we're not getting it, right? My wife's gonna yell at me because I've been saying if I ever get a chance, I'm gonna ask this question, and they're gonna and they're gonna hate you for it. But the question is what are we doing wrong? And you're not allowed to say nothing, right? So, but when you look at what you guys put together, is there? Exactly. Oh, great, give it. I'll shut up. You're not leveling fast enough. Oh, really? How fast should we be leveling? People my campaign started first level, and 2 months later they just hit 3rd. I'm no, level 1 per section for 1st and 2nd, and then every other section. Because we know, and it's one of those things where we know how long people because we keep asking, and this is one of the things where whether it's new players or old players, because this is just life, right? People's campaigns they're measured in months, not years. Yeah, right. Obviously, there's people. I think there was just a video circulating last week of someone who'd been, my 35-year-old campaign. That's awesome. but that's way outlier. Probably a statistical outlier. Yeah, no, completely. Most people play for a few months, and they stop at 5th or 6th level. Right. And I don't think they're stopping because they're I don't like 7th level. I think they're it's just schedules change. This changes, that changes.
So level faster. Don't worry about the mechanics. Level once per session. Like that's
what is the right level? Seriously, is your pace one per session?
Well, my pace. We'll see. Here we go.
I mean, not yours, but like, right? So if you could just reach out and control the minds of the people playing D&D with like and just truly push them in a direction like a mind flayer.
Yeah.
How fast would people progress? Like by hour?
So here's what I would go. I would suggest to Dungeon Masters. Level your players every 4 hours. Just do that once. Just try it. And then see how it works out and see how much you enjoy it. And then figure out from there.
Okay.
Now, I will admit my campaign, the characters, they do go slower. Because because part of it is there's a natural sense. And I think this is just a human tendency. We're all having fun right now. Mm-hmm. Do we really need to level and change things? Like, no, it's like working now, right? Like, it's fun. And I think people just have a natural fear of higher levels, especially Dungeon Masters, because they see all this wild magic coming on board, like teleport, things like that. Cloud kill and whatever it might be, But I think which is funny, because I said now I have a toddler now, so it's hard for me to game outside of work. But even my campaign is kind of intermittent now, but like I think after a year of playing, the characters were 8th level, and I'm like, there's no reason why I couldn't. Right? No, but the same thing happens to me. So I'm not going to say, you guys are doing it wrong, but it's more, there's just a very strong tendency to like think, this is where D&D is. But the funny thing is, I run high level. When we were playtesting the game, I ran stuff 12th, 13th, 14th level, and it worked fine. Right? It was. Now I'm not going to obviously it's more complicated. It's not as easy. Mm-hmm. But I think people get intimidated by it. Mm-hmm. To a point that maybe they're overly intimidated by it. Mm-hmm. That try it. Just try leveling once per session. Just do that very once.
That's great. That's a good one. That's a good one, but that seemed too easy. Like you had that answer. So do you have another way, another thing?
Here's a it's like it's the 500th year. I think it's the 500th anniversary of Martin Luther.
Yeah.
So this is mine, right? I'm nailing this at the front door. You're doing it all wrong. It's like 100 things.
Yeah, but is there something else where like particularly like something that you think is underused in the books? Like you guys put the work in, you really it worked. Like I'm not saying it's like something you put in, you're like, okay, nobody really cares. But something you put in, you're like, if people use this, they would really love this, and they're not.
Average damage for monsters. I was surprised.
That's a good one.
Roll damage.
That's for me. I get yelled at for using average damage. People hate it. Well, not my players. None of my players care at all. They love it. They don't even know.
That's the secret, right?
I'll tell another one. I vary the damage within the dice range, but myself. So like I'm like they're having an easy time. It suddenly turns into max damage.
No, do it. So okay. So this is something that I think is another thing. This is cultural. It's not the rules. But I do think people, because there's this reliance, I think, on the mechanics in 3rd and 4th. Like, if you're, it kind of goes back to my boss monster question. Like, if you set up the encounter and let it go, because it's like a miniatures game. It's like, no, this is drama. Like players want to have fun. They want to be challenged. As long as you're not like lame about it. But if you're lame about it, then people aren't having fun. Mm-hmm. They don't care if like the bubbling cauldron of acid. I added that then. Right when you open the door, I just threw it in there because. Why do you care? It's like you guys like. It's not like someone is like going to record this and go, well, actually, this is how it should have been. Because if you had fun, it doesn't matter how you got there. It literally does not matter how the Dungeon Master gets there, as long as everyone's like, this is an enjoyable thing and we all like it. Right. And I think sometimes DMs worry, especially DMs who are active online, they worry about what the world thinks of their game beyond people. Now I get if you're streaming and stuff, but like even people stream, they don't know that that's not in your notes.
Right.
I actually ran a dungeon once where the dungeon was essentially just a series of random tables. Uh-huh. Like nothing was determined. Like until like I'd have a room where it's like, okay, there are these guys in this room. When the players enter the room, roll a die to see what the story is. Right? It was just like they're hostile, they're disguised werewolves, they're merchants who are lost, they're prisoners. Like, and actually, I found as a dungeon master that was more fun. Right. Because I didn't know what was going to happen next beyond general thing. But it meant I was improvising a ton. But I'm a very improvisational DM, and I get that's not for everyone. But for me, I love half of the fun for me of DMing is how things change, right? Mm-hmm. It's dealing with the unexpected. Mm-hmm. And so when I end a session and it's not the way I thought it was going to end, that to me is really what gets me excited. Because I just love that feeling as a DM, like, that really improvisational back and forth nature of the game. And so I write notes that I make up 2/3 of it as we play. But to me, my players enjoy it. So it's not, it's, I know people say, oh, it's lame, right? You're like, if the entire point of the game is just to have fun, what's the point of having a system? To me, the system is like building a guitar or an instrument.
Mm-hmm.
And everyone's going to play it a little bit differently. As long as you enjoy playing it and your audience enjoys it, who cares if you're playing the guitar like the exact note by note, if you're doing it totally freestyle, if it's a jam session. Every band plays differently. And, there's not one. It's not like, oh, a guitar, you must always play Stairway to Heaven with a guitar.
Right.
It's so I think people get a little too worried about, the procedure of the game rather than the immediate effects of it.
Right. So I have an interesting statistic for you based on the using static monster damage. I actually asked this on Facebook. Facebook is a very active, I think, 100,000 person Facebook group. And I love putting polls up there because it's a real fast way to get like 500 people to respond to a poll and see like, so that's how people are doing it. And, selection bias and everything else, you got to account for that. But so I asked, like, do you roll for damage or do you use the average value for damage? And 530 people responded, and 90% of them roll for damage. So
why?
So you and I can get on this campaign and be like, you're doing it wrong. Your fun is wrong.
It's funny because I was at a conference, I think it was GDC, and the designers of Hearthstone were doing a Q&A. They're talking about random elements in games. And they actually said in Hearthstone, so if you play Hearthstone, some of the cards have random effects.
Yep.
And one of the random effects some cards have is this card does 2 to 3 damage, has a damage rate.
Right.
And barely it's very narrow. And I asked them, they did this really interesting presentation. I asked, what elements of randomness did you find didn't work in your design? And they said, if the damage, and they actually was so funny. I don't know if they knew who I was or what, but if it's what we found, and they used the example of like the 2 to 3 damage, and they literally said, if it was like D&D and the range was 1 to 8, people hated it. And I was like, that's the game I work in. That doesn't help me, right? Like that's the game, right?
Yeah, don't make us all switch to D4s for everything, man. I hate
it. It is funny though. Like I was thinking about, because people will sometimes say, I wish weapons were different. And like long swords and maces were different. I'm like, yeah, they could be different if you guys didn't want to roll damage. Because I could just say a longsword does 5 and the mace does 4 and gets this little benefit, right? And it actually could be different. But when I'm dealing with 4, 6, 8, or 10, I have 4 options and 30 weapons. What do you want? Right?
Yeah, I think it was 13th Age that kind of broke me of dynamic monster damage, right? 13th Age monsters are all static damage.
That's right.
And then a bunch of campaigns with that, and it was so much nicer for me as a DM. Like, no, and it's just like, players don't care. They like the variance in damage on a monster attack. Everyone's like, it'll be too predictable. It's like, not really, because you're missing anything, and you got multiple monsters. So yeah, I agree.
Because everyone builds the spherical cow of, if I know he does 5 and I have 6, I always feel safe. And it's like, I have never seen that happen.
Right, I've never seen it actually happen.
Yeah, right? Yeah, where it's like, I have 4, crap, this guy has to be once I'm dropped, right? That's what I see.
Right. So again, in this really wonderful conversation that you and the 2 Matts and Adam Coble had, and I thought my only complaint with that is it seemed like they gave you about 5 minutes to talk. And I was like, oh my God, what does Mike have to say? But
it was a pretty impressive cast to be part of. So
yeah, that's true, and it was still a delight. One of the things you mentioned is that you through various surveys and feedback that you have seen a pretty stark difference in how newer players are approaching D&D compared to older players. Can you talk more about that?
Sure. So what I can start with is where they're very similar. And now obviously this is proprietary information, so I can't now put up on screen the actual.
You're going to share it with us?
Yeah. Sometimes I kind of wish, but it's like, okay.
Stefan Picorni was on last time, and he gave us all kinds of new stuff.
Yeah. So what's interesting is I'll start with what's the same. And what's the same is how often people play, how long their campaigns run, how many hours they play per week. So it's really interesting to see, it really is just another generation of gamers coming in, right? Very similar lifestyle-wise. But what's really fascinating is, and I'll zero in on one thing, because I think existing players, you have this historical baggage. I like to think of it as what I call the spiked chain issue. And I love naming it. When 3.0 first came out, there was the spiked chain. And it was a really weird weapon. It did 2d4 damage. It was a 2-handed weapon. It was an exotic weapon, which meant you had to use a feat to use it. And it had reach. And so at first, it's really weird, and it's like every single special thing you can give a weapon it has on some level. But what I found was, the first campaigns I played, no one used a spike chain. No one considered it. And then someone, and I imagine this happened in gaming groups across the world, someone built a fighter with expertise, and improved trip. And suddenly the spike chain was the best weapon because it checked every single special ability box, and so it was awesome, right? Yep. And I think that there's a lot of elements of D&D that are like that. That are like, if you've been playing the game for a while, there are certain things and like, oh, this is the right thing to do. Because the funny thing on the spike chain is, if you look, it's not in 5th edition, right? And I think if it ever showed up in 4th edition, it was like so nerfed. It's like, if you didn't play 3rd, you're like, why does this thing need a spike chain and it has terrible stats and I'd never use it? Like, why is it even here? Or like, why do these people hate the spike chain so much, right? Like, because it's always a reaction to what's come before.
Right.
So what's really, I think, fascinating is new players, the classes they like, compared to the classes old players like. Old players like fighter, cleric, wizard, rogue. New players are like warlock, bard, right? Like, it's really like funky, right? And it's so, and in some ways, it's like, this is someone who's never played D&D before. They just looked at the classes. They don't have any like preconceptions about what's typical, and they're picking bards, right? And it's like, it actually makes a lot of sense, because I think the bard, kind of like the spike chain, is something where if you played D&D before, like, oh, everyone knows bards suck. Right? Because everyone knows bards suck. Bards are weak. Bards are lame. Well, in 5th edition, bards are full spellcasters,
right,
who get armor and who get weapons, and get a free buff they can give to people that could be like the thing that's like the difference between making or failing a saving throw.
Sure.
Wait, do bards really suck? Right? And what's interesting is, when you look at new players, I think what they're saying is, oh, that looks awesome. Wait, you mean I get to have a sword and armor, and I can cast spells, and I can heal people, and I can sign me up. We're like, oh, cleric, I just get like a mace. Like, who cares, right? Like, oh, I can turn undead. Big deal, right? Whereas like veteran players are like, oh, you need to be able to turn undead. That's super important. And I think newer players are like, who cares? Roll whatever that's useless, right? And it's just things like that. And same thing with the warlock, where I think it's just like, oh, this guy's like, he's a wizard, but he's got a story, right? Like, that's interesting. And I think it's the same thing, where I think if you played 3rd or 4th, they're like, oh, warlock, that's just a tertiary class, right? No one takes it seriously. You should play a wizard. Where I think new players look at it and go, wait, I can make a pact with like a demon? That's awesome. I want to be that character. I want to be that person. And I do think it might underscore a bit that idea of going more towards story, that new players coming in, I like to think of as for our new players, because we have a bajillion new players coming in. I think when I think of it conceptually, I think playing D&D for the new generation of players is, I get to cosplay without making a costume. Right? That's what it is. Like, I get to act like someone else and be someone else, but I don't have to actually learn how to sew and make a costume and go to a convention. I can just pretend to be this other person by hanging out with my friends and sitting at a table. And I get to actually make up who this person is. And because it's just with my four or five friends, I don't have to explain this person to anyone, because it's my gaming group who's showing up every week to meet this person. And I think that might be part of it. Like, that there is a little bit more, I think younger players are more used to this idea of adopting a different persona, because they've been doing it. I mean, this is a generation that came of age with social media, with the ubiquitous nature of smartphones. They're used to playing characters. They're used to adopting guises very knowingly. Right. And so I think that's where you see some of that coming in. I think they might be thinking of the character classes more as a role to play, a person to be. I think it's why Tabaxi are like everyone. I don't know. I don't have the numbers, but Tabaxi seemed like really popular with people. Obviously, people like cat people, but I think they also like, it's a role, right? I get to play the hyperactive, short attention span kind of troublemaker. Fun, right? And you think how many anime and stuff have that character and that like them, right? So. And that's kind of where I think has changed our thinking from, a character, class, or a race is this collection of mechanics, and thinking it more like, no, this is a role you play. This is a character you get to be. And we'll kind of want to think a lot about what is the stereotypical expression of this class or race as a character that you're playing, rather than just as like a bundle of abilities. So it's not, Tabaxi are like bards and rogues. It's more like, no, Tabaxi are troublemakers. Triton are the arrogant outsiders who don't really understand the world they're in. They're the alien, right? They're sort of like Kal-El falling to Earth, but imagine if he was an adult, right? He just thought, you humans are kind of like, what? This is what you guys do, right? Don't you know what's really going on, right? That kind of thing. Right. And they happen to make good paladins and fighters and stuff like that, whatever it is. Like so I think that's another thing that's really changed. And I think it's interesting to see, like, we get to feel smart because we kind of predicted that, and it seems like that really is where the younger audience is going. So
that's great. So this is somewhat related, and this is also like a personal agenda item of myself, but I think it's one that you will resonate with, because I think.
Oh, did we just freeze up?
No, I think we're okay.
Okay,
Can you hear me?
You froze for a second, so if you had a question...
I moved. Okay, well, I haven't had a question yet.
Oh, okay. Good.
So my question is that the Dungeon Master's Guide has a pretty robust set of optional rules for gridded combat, and has about 3 paragraphs on how to play Theater of the Mind. And yet, certainly in the streaming world, I'm seeing a lot of people playing Theater of the Mind, and and just my own, again, Facebook style surveys on who people playing Theater of the Mind, about 40% of people are playing either abstract maps or Theater of the Mind. 60% playing grid. But to me, it doesn't feel like there's a rule. There's enough guidelines to help new players learn how to run Theater of the Mind. Do you intend for there not to be really rules around this style of play, or do you see it as a gap?
No, I think so far that's kind of the intention. That the idea that kind of trying to rest combat more in that storytelling mode, it seems to be working for people. And there's kind of a funny thing of if you're running Theater of the Mind, like we have to get like, well, why are you doing it that way? Because we know the shift is basically, it stayed pretty consistent that it's 50-50 miniatures, there's no minis. And the funny thing becomes, well, are people not using miniatures because they want it simpler, they want to keep it fast moving, and they actually don't want more rules? Because there is a thing of like, well, if you want more structure, then maybe you should just use minis in the grid. And that's kind of where I sit on it. Now, that's obviously something that could change as the audience and we see feedback. But it's kind of the feeling right now that if you want more structure and you want things more procedural, that miniatures are just kind of the best way to encapsulate that. That I kind of worry that doing stuff that's adding more structure to not using miniatures, just going more for descriptive, it might be this kind of unhappy third way where it's like you want structure and clarity, you use miniatures. You want to be more just like it's kind of loose and we're just sort of playing. You don't use miniatures. Does the third path that sits in the middle actually make anyone happy, or is it just you're getting the worst of both worlds? Right? Like, you're not getting necessarily the precision you want. The player who's like, I want to know exactly where I am. Right. Or I like being able to just look and see where things are. That helps me keep things clear. Or the group that's more like, well, like when I run the game, I don't use miniatures, and I tend generally run things very loosely. It's more just, I want to run over and whack this guy. Okay, you do, right? Or it's like, well, okay, actually, it turns out there's an ogre in the way. So, okay, do you want to give the opportunity attack, or do you want to attack the ogre, right? Things like that. And that's generally how I manage combat, where it's, because I kind of know my players, they're not going to pay attention anyways when it's not their turn. So you just kind of frame it as, here's what your character sees, and here's kind of your options, or give and take. So it's not something which we're necessarily going to go hard. I know we talked, and I can't remember if these are in Xanathars or not. I know we worked out some rules for like how to quickly handle spell area effects. Like
you had some stuff of that in the DMG. There was a number of creatures that you could have in a certain area blast, and you just basic trigonometry on the fly, and you could figure it out.
I'm trying to remember if there was for some reason I had some weird memory of like working on something with Xanathars with that, but I might just be misremembering.
I hope you're right.
It might not have survived into the final.
Oh, bummer.
Ninjas, because I don't know if it actually did anything better than what was already in the DMG.
Right.
So, but yeah, so it's one of those things where for right now, I don't think we know enough. Like you mentioned earlier, like we're 3 years in. I don't know if after the first 3 years we have a really good handle on what would be useful. Because I think if I was to write an Unearthed Arcana right now to try to like, oh, here's more structure to like if you're not using miniatures, I almost have a feeling that players, if you were to like really get inside what DMs are doing, they'd want like, give me the I think I actually asked on Twitter about this. Do you want a combat system that's even simpler? Right. Where, like you could resolve a fight in one die roll.
Yeah, I remember. I was real excited when you put that. And then the poll, I think, was pretty positive that people did, if I recall.
Yeah. So it almost kind of feels like if we were to take another step with combat, we would actually go to even more abstract systems.
Gotcha. Yeah, something that really steps way back.
Yeah. Now I have no idea how to implement that.
No, I thought you had it ready.
There,
Man, I'm waiting every Monday. I'm like, hey, is Mike Mearls' combat rules, are they out yet? No.
This. Oh well, right? Yeah. So do I.
Yeah. I find it very interesting, and this is one that people are using other people as an excuse for something that they want, right? So I have rules that I use for narrative combat. I actually have like a single sheet PDF that I hand out to people and say, here's when we're running ungridded, Theater of the Mind combat, here's kind of the idea. And it's very, just like you said, it's sort of, if you want to do something, say you want to do it, and most likely you can, unless it's totally unreasonable, right?
Yeah.
And it occurred to me, like, well, how does a new person, and I have one example of somebody who did this with the starter set, where they opened it up and they're seeing 5-foot measurements on everything, but they're not seeing any map, and they're like, well, how am I supposed to measure out 5? Like, how do I know? They ask, like, is the goblin 30 feet away or not? And I don't know. I don't have any idea if the goblin's 30 feet away. And you're like, well, you just make it up, right? But it doesn't say, like, just make it up. Yeah. So I always think, like, I imagine that there's this army of new players that are just struggling just opening the starter set and struggling with the idea of how to figure out in their head how to do 5-foot resolution combat. But then the reality is, no, it's really just I want it. And I think, like, probably this, while I was kind of going through the arguments in my head, the head version of Mike Mearls told me that there, if you were to come out with one, there would be 9 out of 10 people who said you didn't do it the right way.
Yeah, that's true too.
Because they already have their way, So that occurs to me. But it was one where it's like, well, if that's true, but with gridded combat, there's a ton of rules. Like, there's 2 totally separate sets of rules. One facing, and one with all kinds of stuff, flanking, and all kinds of options. So I don't know. But yeah.
And it's interesting because I think I think it was talking to Adam Coble at Gen Con about this, and we still have to get the schedule, was actually doing something where, like, well, let's talk to a bunch of streamers and say, well, how would you change the D&D system to make streaming easier, right? Because I kind of fell into that thing of, like, well, what if instead of going, you have minis, no minis, instead of going between those two, what if you went further to what I think it was to the right, like even further away from miniatures? What would that look like? Would that be something would that be good for streaming? Would it be good for it's more narrative? And so it's an interesting.
What they say.
We haven't had that yet. Well, we talked.
Oh, you're going to talk about that. Oh, cool.
Right, yeah, like look, why don't we do like a design jam where we just have a couple of people sit in on a meeting, or just give us some ideas, or we just do a bunch of iteration on some concepts, and just talk to people who've streamed a lot and get their impressions of, like, what works and what doesn't. You basically have them as design consultants. Mm-hmm. So, because I think there might be something out there that we're like, we don't quite know the shape of it. Like, I kind of directionally maybe know, but I don't really know exactly what it might look like yet.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So you talked a little bit, and I don't know if you have your copy right there on hand with you, but Xanathar's Guide, and we've seen a whole lot. Obviously, I think I'm going to make a statistic up out of my head. Many people, I could say many, and I'm statistically okay. So many people are clearly interested in the new class builds, right? Oh, like they feel like, I know. I mean, I've been running UA content at my games, and people love the UA stuff. So I know that people are going to be real excited about it. And the D&D Beyond has had all the video series going through the various classes, but we haven't heard a lot about what us poor DMs get. And I know there is stuff. The table of content shows a lot. Are there particular areas in Xanathar's Guide you think are really going to help us poor DMs run our games better and easier?
Yeah, so the one thing that has stood out that I've actually been happy about this, because there's something I had in my own campaign, and I think that the things that that we create based on our own campaigns or on actual experience always seem to do the best, was the expanded section on tools. Because tools are one of those things where it's like, oh, I'm proficient with the brewer's tools or kit or whatever it's called. And like, what does this thing even look like, right? Am I carrying an empty keg around? Like, whatever. So that's one thing where, and it's kind of an interesting test in some ways of the 5th edition philosophy, in that this section, it covers every single tool from the Player's Handbook. Gets a pretty, it's not super in depth, but it's like half page for each one. And it lays out, and we had an Unearthed Arcana on this, right, where it says, I believe we did it on Unearthed Arcana, I can't remember now, because we just moved desks. I literally spent it moving stuff. At noon at lunch, I felt exhausted, and I looked at my Fitbit and was like, oh, I just got all my steps in for the day already. So, but the idea is you take each tool and then describe, like, here's what this tool is, because not all of them actually get descriptions of the Player's Handbook. I didn't really realize that until we get questions and you look and go, oh yeah, we actually don't tell you what a brewer's kit actually is. So it tells you what it includes, and then it gives, essentially, it's DM advice for, like, hey, that assumes someone in your group took this proficiency, and they feel, oh, this is lame, I don't really know what I'm supposed to do with it. And here are ways you can make it a lot more interesting and more fun. Mm-hmm. And it approaches it in 2 ways. On one level, it says, okay, essentially let the player use that tool in place of a skill that they don't have. Mm-hmm. So take herbalism kit. It's like, okay, you're good at gathering herbs and plants, and you can, and it assumes then, okay, it's not just a kit that you know how to use, but you know the knowledge around it. So it's kind of like saying someone who is a professional truck driver, they know how to drive a truck. Okay, cool. But we can also assume they know the geography of the area that they're in, or like maybe even nationally if they drive cross country, because that's just something you'd pick up as part of driving. Like if someone's like, hey, haul this from Dallas, Texas to to New York City, well, you need to know how to get there, right? Like, so it basically takes situations where the training around that tool could be useful and could replace a skill. So for instance, with the herbalism kit, you might say, oh, okay, if you are trying to figure out how someone got poisoned, the kit proficiency might help you make that in place of investigation, because you can recognize, wait, this plant's poisonous, and it looks like this was the actual poison used here. Brewer's kit, like, oh, if you're inspecting, like, oh, was this drink poisoned? Well, I know how to, as a brewer, I know something about alcohol and what beer should smell like or whatever, so I can tell if something's off. The colors are wrong. This isn't what this thing should be. It assumes that there's some expertise there. And it suggests, like, if the player has both the skill and the tool, to then give them additional bonus, like advantage. Like that. Now, the challenge, why I say it's kind of a test of 5th edition, is the idea isn't that these are now canonical rules for tools. Where we're not saying, hey, here's how tools work, and now each tool has a half page of text. Which is like, great, now the game's 8 times more complicated. But the idea is that it's a tool for DMs to use to say, hey, in my campaign, I've noticed the dwarf player has brewery proficiency, and it kind of feels like, it's lame. Okay, well, take this section of Xanathar, hand it to your player, and say, well, here, use this, right? And I can almost see it being something which ideally, if you say, hey, like, what's the ideal use? It's not, hey, new player, pick a proficiency, read this chapter, right? Maybe you'll take a tool or not. No, but it's more like, hey, new player, you're 3rd level, and you're playing that dwarf, and you noticed your brewery, you don't really know what to do with you're using your other skills, you've learned those, but your brewery tool proficiency is just sitting there. Okay, now DM, now show them this one specific thing to kind of get them to start thinking about it, right? And that kind of has the caveat too, like maybe the players noticed, like, hey, I have this thing, I never use it, right? And I want to get more mileage out of it. Okay, well, here's how, let's work together. Okay, now I'm going to use this specific set of rules to give you some more options in play. And so that's kind of where it's a test of the 5th edition ethos of, like, in earlier editions, especially like in 3rd, this would have been, okay, everyone.
A whole new subset,
Yeah. Here is literally like 15 more pages on tools. And so God help you if a player takes 3 tool proficiencies. And now everyone's taking tool proficiencies instead of skills.
28-page character sheet.
Yeah, exactly. So it's going to be interesting to see how those affect the game. And I think that's another thing which this is letting us do, is kind of push the boundaries a bit and find out what can we do and how can we do it.
Right.
So, rather than just like, oh, a new book comes out, it's as important as the player's handbook. Like, we're very much not taking that attitude.
Sure. That's great. So we have a 3rd member of our party tonight. Alex Basso is producing the whole show, and he has some questions that people have submitted on Twitter and through Twitch. Alex, do you have a question for Mike?
Yeah, thank you for everyone who submitted questions. So we'll start. Here's the first one from Twitter. This is from Wise Papa Grant. If you had 1 hour to prepare and run an adventure for brand new D&D players and just the 3 core rule books, what would you prioritize?
I think I'd want to really prioritize, in terms of the adventure design, the idea that this is a world where players have a lot of options. But obviously for new players, I don't want to just give them infinite options. So what I would want to do is give the players a situation where it kind of goes back to this idea, I'm going to kind of give them a question, but it doesn't have an answer. So, something like the classic setup, you're going to a town, right? Like that, just like out of the starter set. And I'd want the first question they answer, it would be the answer to me of what kind of game do they want to play, where you come across this group of merchants, they've been ambushed. They know one of the merchants has been kidnapped, but the other merchants are, their guards are too injured, like they can't effectively defend themselves. What do you do, right? Like, and then you can kind of know, okay, are we the group that chases after the monster? Are we the group that wants to hang out with these merchants? And maybe the merchants are a little sketchy, like, oh, these guys, they shouldn't be here. They might be smuggling something, right? And so now you have a lot of questions. And then the players, through their actions, can show me what they want to do. Because I think one thing that's hard that I think experienced players do that can overwhelm a new player is like questions like, what kind of campaign do you want to play? That's a big question for someone who hasn't played before. It's like saying, okay, you've never had Filipino food before, ever. But tell me what you want. It's like, well, I don't know, right? Like, here's a menu, and I'm not going to actually try to explain this to you. Like, try to pick things out that you might like. Like, I don't really, so this is a classic thing of, if it's someone's first time at the cuisine, you guide them. You don't just tell them what to order because you don't know what they want, but you kind of guide them, right? You might give them, well, would you look at these 3 things, right? Or like, what kind of things do you like? Like, tell me in the words of things you've already done to help guide me. So that's what I do. I would focus on and want that first scenario the players deal with to be an answer to the question of what kind of game do you want to play, and give them a real stark, 2 or 3 options that they can go with.
That's great. Alex, what other questions do you have?
I guess kind of follow that up. Here's one from Hadnerf Allen in Twitch. In your games, how do you collect and implement ongoing feedback from the players?
Good question.
Oh, so one of the things I did was I think when the players hit 4th or 5th level, I actually sent out a little survey, said, hey, what does your character want to do? Right? Like, here's what's happened. Here's where you guys are now. What are your character's plans? And I tried to keep it like wedged in the game world to kind of get people to kind of focus in on like what specifically I can implement, like in terms of the game, when I can show them. And it was funny because they all basically said the same thing. They wanted to kill this guy. So it made my job pretty easy. But it was something where it was a good way, I think, to sort of sort out like over 5 levels of play and over the course of a couple months what had stood out. And it also meant that the stuff I wanted to double down on, it verified that, that was the right choice. And I kind of knew they hated this guy, but it helped kind of clarify that. So this is the right choice. Like making this guy more prominent, having him show up and start messing with the players would get their attention. So I think that's a good way to think of it. I kind of almost phrase it as, what does your character want to spend the next month doing? Like, what are your character's goals? And so that kind of helps, bring things into focus.
Do you get pretty good feedback on that? Like, I know many groups, like they get maybe, 2 out of their 5 or 6 players actually respond.
No, I think it's fine because I think in a lot of D&D groups, you have a natural cross section of interest.
Right.
I think everyone enjoys the game, but some people would say I'm here because it's social, and some people are like, no, I'm here because I want to like.
They're like, I don't know, it's good.
Yeah, I'm having fun. I'm fighting monsters. It's interesting to watch the game. It's funny, or I get to talk to my funny voice. Yeah, no, so I think that's fine. Like, I think as long as you're getting at least one good answer, unless the answer is like you just know, like, okay, this is not going to make people happy. Like this person might like this, but no one else will. I'm pretty lucky in that I working at Wizards, you have pretty dedicated players. So,
right.
but I think if out of 5 you had 2 people respond, I think that's solid. That's a good way to go. And then
still something to work with.
Yeah, exactly. I think the challenge then is how do I kind of weave an answer that answers both players rather than just making it very like one player at a time.
Right. Alex, what else you got?
Okay, here's one from AlphaStream on Twitter.
Oh, AlphaStream.
The strategy of a core adventure every 6 to 12 months seems to be going strong, but is there any worry it might slow as DMs have backlog?
Yeah, no, that's definitely something we think of, in terms of like, we know that every product we put out, that changes what's on the shelf. And so, it's an open question of what that actually means. I think it does mean you might see us start doing new types of products. And I think that we always want to try to do something that's different. Like when we did Tales Standing Portal, that was not like anything else we had done, right? And it's like, it's not a big adventure.
Yeah, it gave me a vacation.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, thank God. I don't have to like wrap up Storm King's Thunder in the next 6 months.
Yeah.
I actually have a year to run a campaign.
Yeah, no, yeah, exactly. Because you see now we know, okay, if you're like, hey, I want to run a campaign, well, now we have like five of them.
Yeah.
So it's not as important. Like I know at the first year we did 2, right? We're doing them in a much more rapid pace. And then I think the other thing is, we know that there's different types of content people want. I think that, the main annual storyline seems to be working pretty well for us because especially from an interest standpoint for new players, it seems to be a really good way to get new people to come in. Because you're using a language that's not like, hey, you don't have to have already played D&D before to get it.
Right. It's kind of new for everybody, right?
Exactly. And it's also like the language is like, hey, does the idea of going to like a distant, jungle filled with undead sound exciting? Oh yeah, okay, you can play. Try Dungeons and Dragons, right? We're getting game marketing is much more focused on like, here's the story, because you don't have to be a game player to get it, or a player of that specific game. But I think the interesting question becomes, what about the other products we do? And how do we keep people engaged? And we want to avoid falling into 2 patterns that are too predictable. And I think we also want to make sure that we're reacting to what the audience wants. Like because like you said, we didn't know where D&D was going to end up when we launched it with 5th. And I'd be lying if I said I know exactly where we're going to be 3 years from now, right? Because I think every product you release changes the audience, right? It changes how people think of the game, and then it changes what you might be doing in response. So I think it's up to us to always try to, like, I think at the end of the day, I talked earlier, you think more in terms of just general reactions. Like, here's your boss fight isn't about the aboleth, it's about frustrating the players, right? It's about distance, but how kind of get there in time. I think for us, every product is the challenge is how do we get people who've been playing D&D for 40 years or for 40 days or 40 hours? Why should they be all excited about this?
Sorry, go ahead.
I think that just comes down to it should be something that makes you go, wow, oh, I didn't expect that. That's interesting. And we want to avoid falling into ruts, and we want to do new stuff. And I think if we're going to risk anything, we'd risk on the side of doing something that's too new rather than something that's too much like what's come before.
I know that no one wants to hear about my D&D game, but since the Aboleth came back up, I have to mention how that actually ended up. And it ended up with them making a deal with the Aboleth, and 2 of them joined the Abolithic sovereignty.
Oh, nice. Cool.
Tentacles on the nose and everything. And I was like, man, that's the best boss fight I ever had.
That is awesome.
Yeah, it turned out to work out. I was like, I think I'm going to have to kill myself because now I'm part of the sovereignty. They're seeing everything I see. It's pretty great. Alex, what else you got? You got time? Oh, so we might have time for 2 more questions. And can one of them be that question about the monster manual?
Oh, that question.
Yes. I'll ask that one last, as I bring it up after this one. This one is from A Real Geek on Twitter. He would like to know, what subclass from Xanathars is your favorite crunch-wise, and why?
So the easy answer is the Hexblade, because I like the Hexblade. I was so happy when it hit the threshold for people approving it, because I just love playing the sinister Elric Warlock Warrior. But I think I've said that elsewhere. So, but if I was to set that aside and give a different answer, I think of the other subclasses, it's hard, right? Because there's so many fun ones. But I think, can only pick one. I think I like the Zealot Barbarian, just because, again, it has that concept of the role you're playing. And I like the idea of, what I'd imagine if I was going to play a Zealot, I'd play this rail-thin, fanatic guy who's just growling, and he's just this religious nut, right? Tempest, whatever.
He does a big sign.
Yeah, no, right. At the end is mine. He just smashes you in the face with the sign. Right? And it's just he's got that crazy.
Aegon is coming.
Yeah, right. And it's just bang, right in the face. So I think that's who I think I would play if I had a chance. Just the real over the top religious fanatic who's just berserker.
That's great, Alex. Our last question.
Okay, this one is from at the GDG or the GD game. How would you change the monster manual, knowing what you know now?
So I think if I was going to change anything about the monster manual, I would. We talked about at one point in developing it that we would include tables of flaws, bonds, and traits for all the monsters, and I wish we had done that. Because I think that is something that would really tell people monsters exist for role playing, right? As NPCs. This isn't obviously it's the monster manual, but it's also kind of your NPC manual. That when you think of a red dragon, sure, a red dragon is it's a powerful monster, but it's also a powerful being, right? It's an NPC in your world. I was just thinking, I was noodling around with some campaign ideas, and what if you had a campaign in this area of the world, a red dragon had conquered a dwarf clan and now ruled it. Right, and he didn't enslave them. He was just I now rule you, and if I enslave you, you'll be resentful and everything. So what I'm going to do is spare you and create a compact where I'm your king now, and you'll respect me and serve me. But I'm going to treat you well, because if I treat you well, in my lawful evil mind, what I figured out is if I instead eat your enemies, you'll be the best vassals I could have. So there's just a kingdom ruled by a red dragon. It's a kingdom of the dwarves, right? Things like that, where you just think of them more as entities in the world rather than as
stat block.
Yeah, exactly. And so especially things like kobolds and orcs, I think we could have gotten a lot of mileage out of that by just showing rather than telling you. We can tell you what a kobold's like, but if we give you a bunch of role-playing traits for kobolds that show you that kobolds are these kind of nervous, skittery little, high anxiety creatures, they have 4 hit points and they know it, that might make them something that's more fun beyond just being a monster to fight.
So I have to end the show. I have a sin that I need to confess to you.
Okay.
And need your absolution on.
You got it.
So I've run 5th edition now for 3 years, 2 different weekly campaigns. I am just now getting around to actually reading the monster manual.
Well, there you go.
And holy cow, every page has an adventure in it. And I know that's that sounds totally, like the blurb on the back of the book. But I'm reading the Aarakocra, and I'm like, oh my god, they have the whole thing about Miska the wolf spider in here. And then I'm reading the bullywugs, and I'm like, I could run an entire campaign about bullywugs. and I'm like only on, I think I'm up to the Cambion, and I'm like, I gotta stop, right? Like I needed to take a break. This is too much stuff. So like one major thing that I'm pushing the hell out of is for people to actually read the monster manual, because there's such great stuff in it that I'm not using.
And that's another thing where I think new players, it's interesting because we did Volos with all the monster mythology.
Yeah, right.
And it's interesting how kind of sticky that has been, especially I think with younger players, because they don't know to not read the monster.
Right. Yeah, my niece had the monster manual. She read the hell out of it.
Yeah.
She knows way more about D&D than I do.
No, and that's true, right? Because I'd be the same way. Like, I know what it works.
Yeah, I just need a stat block, man. I got people coming tonight. Like,
exactly.
Give me a basilisk.
It's been interesting. Like when I talk to newer players, they'll know all about Groosh and orcs and why orcs fight other folk and all this other stuff. It's always kind of interesting. Like, oh, okay, like they don't know they're not supposed to read it.
Yeah, it's really, really great. Yeah,
cool. Thank you. Well, you are absolved.
Oh,
so, whatever authority I have.
I want to thank you for coming on the show tonight. This has been great. I learned a lot, and I'm as excited about the hobby as I've ever been. So thank you for all the hard work that you guys do on it, and thank you for coming on the show. I really appreciate it.
Cool. Well, thanks for having me. Thanks for hosting this show. And
do you have anything you want to plug?
Xanathar's Guide, everything coming in. I gotta be a good pitch man.
Where can people find you?
I'm sorry?
Where can people find you? Where how do you best like to communicate with people?
So I am mainly on Twitter because 140 characters is the perfect size for a question and a response.
Right.
So yeah, I'm at
80.
I'm at Mike Mearls, just one word on Twitter. So yeah, and soon I guess I have 200. I still don't have 280 characters.
I don't have 200. A bunch of jerks have 280, but I don't have 280 yet.
Someday, right? Well, even absolved now if not reading the last mails. Maybe that's
maybe I'll get 280.
Yeah.
I don't think those are connected, but whatever. Anyway, thank you again for coming on the show. It's been absolutely wonderful.
Cool. Thanks for having me. I had a great time.
All right, thanks everybody for tuning in. We'll be back Wednesday night at 10:30 Eastern with the Venture Maiden stream, so make sure to tune in for that. Have a great night, everyone.